Spellbinding. Good morning. Thank you all for joining us today. I'd like to welcome the Acting Director of the Office of Management and Budget, Russ Vaught. This is a fitting topic for this subcommittee's first budget hearing of the year because OMB oversees the implementation of the President's agenda and prepares the President's budget. That budget offers a chance for this administration to lay out in detail its vision and priorities for America. Unfortunately, it's hard to imagine being more frustrated by what OMB has delivered this year. The budget deeply slashes programs that support the most vulnerable among us, the sick, the elderly, the poor, while doubling down on a discredited economic policy that widens the inequalities in our society. Overall, the budget cuts non-defense discretionary spending by 9% in 2020. To get there, it slashes programs that working and middle-class Americans rely on for bare necessities like food, transportation, medical care, and housing. As justification for these cuts, the budget cites the pressing need to cut deficits and stabilize the national debt, conveniently forgetting that the deficits are ballooning right now because of the tax cuts for the wealthiest. As a reminder, this administration has claimed and continues to claim that its 2017 tax cuts will pay for itself and more. Yet, Goldman Sachs, hardly a liberal bastion, concluded that it would add as little as 0.3% to GDP in 2018 and 2019, and could be slightly negative in 2020 and beyond. And the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office has estimated that the tax cut bill will increase the total deficit by almost $2 trillion over the next 10 years. To pay for this, the President breaks his promise to the American people and cuts as much as $1.5 trillion out of Medicaid and $500 billion from Medicare, while once again calling for the repeal of the Affordable Care Act. In short, this budget puts the price of these tax cuts for the rich squarely on the backs of hardworking, regular Americans. And it gets worse. The budget relies on gimmicks, false savings, and unsustainable assumptions to cover up the full impact of its disastrous policies. For example, the budget makes extremely unrealistic economic growth assumptions to mitigate the true impacts of its policies on the deficit. It estimates that the GDP will grow by roughly 3% each and every year over the next decade. That is a full percentage point higher than most serious economic experts believe is possible. And according to the President's own economic report, that growth is contingent on even more tax cuts and non-existent increases in infrastructure spending. The budget also relies on a so-called two-penny plan to further reduce non-defense discretionary spending to 27% below the 2019 level. It hardly can be called a plan. The budget doesn't spell out any of the hundreds of hard choices that would be necessary to cut spending that drastically, and it's completely unrealistic. Meanwhile, OMB asks other agencies to make drastic cuts, but is hardly willing to do so itself. It proposes a cut of less than 1% after accounting for funding it shifts elsewhere or that aren't part of OMB's core responsibilities. On defense, the budget rejects the long-standing principle of parity and once again avoids making hard choices. Rather than making a workable proposal to increase budget caps for defense and non-defense spending in tandem, the budget uses sleight of hand to sidestep the issue entirely. The administration makes no adjustments to the budget caps. Instead, it proposes, quite unapologetically, to get around them and bump up defense spending by 5% by increasing the overseas war fund to the tune of $100 billion. And I quote Mr. Mulvaney, "If appropriations come across with any OCO money hidden in it, I'll do everything I can to strip it. It's a slush fund and a gimmick, and our own budget called it a backdoor trick last year." Politico, 4/30/2015. The budget also proposes $5 billion of additional funding for a border wall that Congress and the majority of the American people have already rejected. Despite all this fantastical growth numbers, unrealistic cuts, and numerous gimmicks, the administration still fails to balance the budget by the end of the decade, a standard set by Republicans when deficits will still exceed $200 billion. This budget strays so far from reality, in fact, they'll really have no choice but to disregard it entirely. We'll continue to exercise the power of the purse to benefit all Americans, even if the administration doesn't seem interested. Finally, it would be remiss if I didn't mention frustrations by the way OMB has conducted its management and oversight work. OMB doesn't just prepare the president's budget. It clears regulations and testimony and oversees government-wide policies and initiatives. Yet this administration, officials at multiple agencies have committed repeated and egregious violations of ethic rules and other government regulations, costing taxpayers potentially millions of dollars. We don't have enough time to mention all the questionable spending decisions appointees have made on travel, office renovations, and furniture. We also continue to be concerned about the general lack of transparency and responsiveness from this administration on ethical and budgetary issues. Agencies continue to complain to us that their reports, testimony, and questions get routinely stuck in the OMB clearance process. This subcommittee provides significant budgetary resources to OMB to help address and improve these and other government-wide policies, and it is aggravating to only see the problems get worse. I look forward to discussing these issues in more detail. Before I turn to the acting director, I would like to recognize Mr. Graves for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Always enjoy your positive and encouraging opening statements.
I learned from the master.
You didn't let us down today at all. Well, Acting Director, welcome. I want to thank you for joining us today, but most importantly, it's your birthday. Thank you for spending your birthday with us. That shows where we all are in life. I think I've spent my birthday here several times too. So, but great to have you. I appreciate your efforts and what you've done with the budget and your staff. I know it's taken a lot of work, and I hear the comments from the chairman here about his insights into your. In the budget you've presented, and so I actually look forward to seeing the budget they present someday, one which I haven't seen presented. So at least you've taken that first step, and we're grateful for that. I know it's a lot of hard work, and I've publicly said, I mean, you've taken a courageous step forward in what you presented to us as Congress. And how you foresee budgeting and a recommendation to us, and not only have you done that, you've done it in a way that where some would say your hands were tied just a bit. You know, you're operating under constraints, and those are budgetary caps that were adopted by Congress, 8 years ago, I believe. And it was a Congress that said, hey, if you allow us to raise the debt limit, we promise we won't spend more than these amounts of dollars over the next several years. But each time it seems like it's been raised. And I appreciate your intent as you looked at this. There's no anticipation of a cap raise. In fact, you say, Congress, that is your job if you're going to change the spending levels. Do that. But until then, we will show you how we would recommend spending dollars under the certain constraints we have. So thank you for what you've done there. It is clear to me that you've recognized the national debt is $22 trillion. It's not something that happened on your watch, nor on this president's watch. In fact, under the previous administration, the debt doubled, or nearly doubled, in those short 8 years. And so it's, in fact, an inherited debt that I would say that you're trying to manage right now, and you're taking some great strides forward to show us how we can reduce spending by $2.7 trillion over the next 10 years, which takes a lot of work, and I applaud the administration for embracing what we would say is reality. I mean, these are bold steps you're showing us and making some tough choices rather than playing it safe, like many like to do in this town. I agree with a lot of parts of what you've presented. I look forward to hearing your presentation today. But let me just point out the investment in our military and national defense is something that we should all be supportive of and not critical of in any way. That should be our number one focus, and I know that's been the administration's number one focus, all the way down to not only national security from a broad context, but national security here, locally, at home, on our border, and how the administration is doing everything possible within their legal means to make sure our country is safe. So let me thank you for that as well. Keeping the promise to secure our border, whether it means building a wall, whether it means investment in technology, infrastructure, personnel, whatever it is, you guys have done a fantastic job of staying at it and not yielding to some of the political winds around here. I do want to point out to the chairman that OMB is actually operating or proposing an operation of spending less. I think you mentioned 1% with some money movement, but my understanding under this budget is there's actually an 11% reduction. That is living by example, and something that I think a lot of your agencies are actually looking at. I think it was a 5% mandatory cut in some cases that y'all were looking at all across the board. So thank you for your willingness to do that. And I just wanted to correctly point out that you're willing to do more with less and live within the constraints that Congress has imposed upon the federal government and our spending levels. And you've taken some steps to show us some bold answers and how that can be done. I know they're not easy choices, but somebody had to make them, and I'm glad you were there to make those choices for us. So I look forward to working with the chairman here as we go through this hearing and as we put together the appropriations request in the days ahead. But Mr. Vaught, again, thanks for being here and happy birthday. Look forward to spending some time with you.
Mr. Vaught, I didn't know, and Jack Benny's paraphrase, happy 29 again. We're glad you're here, and we look forward to your opening statement, keeping in mind, as Mr. Graves would have always, that we have your official statement on record, so you can stay as close to 5 minutes as possible would be appreciated.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Quigley, Ranking Member Graves, members of the subcommittee, I appreciate the opportunity to be here today to discuss the President's budget request for 2020 for the Office of Management and Budget, or OMB. I submitted to you my full opening statement, and I'll just give a brief overview here today. The full request for OMB is $116.6 million, which is an 11% cut from the fiscal year 19 enacted level. This reduction demonstrates OMB's own commitment to fiscal discipline and efficiency as we enforce these same principles across the executive branch. Within OMB's request, $101.6 million will support a staffing level of 477 FTEs. The request reflects a decrease of 1.4 million and 16 FTEs below the enacted level in 19. OMB is also requesting $15 million for the Information Technology Oversight and Reform Fund, or ITOR, another OMB account. This is a $13.5 million decrease below the 19 enacted. To ensure that its important to work continues, ITOR anticipates collecting $3 million in reimbursable funding from the U.S. Digital Service agency teams for personnel that USDS details to those agencies. The proposed funding will allow OMB to continue to modernize and improve government operations and service and delivery of IT. On top of the $116.6 million request, OMB is requesting an additional $400,000 in 3 FTEs to establish a new office that will provide government-wide strategic direction on federal human capital policy and coordinate personnel policies, regulations, and procedures for the executive branch. This request is part of a legislative proposal to reform the Office of Personnel Management, and OMB's human capital leadership will be in conjunction with OPM's activities that will be vested within the General Services Administration. OMB continues to focus on strengthening and improving not only OMB's organizational effectiveness, but also increasing the effectiveness of the federal government to serve the needs of the 21st century. For example, regulatory reform, where OMB reviews tax-related and similar regulations with the goal of ensuring that the regulations adhere to core government principles and are transparent, simple, efficient, and pro-growth. And implementation of the President's management agenda consistent with the administration's reshaping the American government reform and reorganization recommendations, which serves as the cornerstone for a productive bipartisan dialogue on structurally realigning the federal government to more effectively operate in this century. Before I close, I know based on past hearings that there is a large interest in this subcommittee to discuss the overall President's budget request. Similar to President Trump's previous budgets, the fiscal year 2020 budget was written with everyday Americans in mind. This year, President Trump directed most agencies to meet a target of 5% reduction to non-defense discretionary spending. I'm proud to report to you that the fiscal year 20 budget achieves that goal, and OMB has held itself to the same high standard of fiscal discipline. The President came to Washington with a commitment to help get our fiscal house in order and end wasteful spending, and we believe this President's budget does that. With that, I want to thank you and look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Let me begin, sir. Just some policy issues and procedures within the administration. According to recent press reports, senior White House officials appear to be using WhatsApp to conduct official government business. First question would be, are you aware of this, and does the practice comply with OMB's official guidance on record keeping?
I've read what I've read in the paper, what you've read. I can't speak to whether it complies. Obviously, we need to be doing official government business in areas such as email that comport with the Federal Records Administration. I can't speak to what steps other senior administration officials have taken, but I've read the same press reports that you have.
If you can't speak to it, with all due respect, who can? Isn't it OMB's responsibility to manage this from the overall point of view? And I understand you can't officiate every person's activities, but you set the policy, correct?
We do set many of these types of policies. I know that you mentioned some of the instances of waste, fraud, and abuse that we've attempted to identify, and whether it came to private travel or other areas. We do set policies, and then we expect agencies to take those policies to heart and align their behavior and practices and work with their inspector generals that are in the enforcement business.
So who can answer the question? Does WhatsApp comply with the government policy regarding record keeping?
I'd have to refer you to the various general counsel's office for the agencies that are within the executive branch to comply with the laws that are in place.
Well, what law is in place right now as it involves record keeping and the use of WhatsApp, for example? Even if a person wanted to know, who would they go to?
I think first and foremost, they would probably go to the Federal Records Act that requires federal officials to keep track of the documents that they are working on to be able to preserve an accurate historical record.
But respectfully, let's just say a senior official at the White House wants to use WhatsApp. They call you because apparently, as you say, you set this policy. Would you then refer them to general counsel? Would you? I mean, if you set the policy, don't you refer to general counsel and others to find out what the law is and then set the policy?
We do. We also work with the general counsels to make sure that their staff are complying with the various laws that are in place. And I know that the agencies do that. I would refer you to each one of those agencies to decide as to how well they're doing in complying. I know the White House does that as well through their own White House counsel.
I'll just try it one more time. What is the policy? What is your understanding of the policy about using WhatsApp?
To my knowledge,
government,
Mr. Chairman, it's to comply with the laws that are in place, including the Federal Records Act, to ensure that federal officials are keeping a historical record of their documents.
Is it okay to use WhatsApp as an official under the guidance of record keeping?
It should not be. We shouldn't be using personal devices for government business. So I think if that answers your question, there's often times where things come in and you have to get it to your federal your device and do as best you possibly can to comply with the Federal Records Act.
And I want to make it generic. I don't know for sure if anybody's using WhatsApp. I just want to know. First, they shouldn't be using a personal device. Second, if they're using a personal device or an official one, I would assume that if we were trying to keep records that they shouldn't use WhatsApp. Isn't that correct?
I think that's fair.
Thank you very much. I refer now to the ranking member, Mr. Graves.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Joyce has another hearing to step into that he's ranker on, so I'd yield some time to him if you don't mind. Is that okay? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for your generosity, Mr. Ranking Member, and thank you for being here on your birthday. And I agree with where Mr. Quigley was going, and certainly as a former prosecutor, the collection of records and documents that have been part of your government activity should be stored someplace, and certainly you shouldn't have like a Secretary of State acting out and setting up servers in their own home and dealing in instruments of top-notch security, top clearance security outside that premise. So it would certainly be something that OMB, if they have the opportunity, should put even stricter guidelines on it and make sure all the people who have not complied with the law in the past are held to account for that as well. There are, speaking of holding people to account, there are several financial regulators, such as the Office of Financial Research and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, whose operations are outside of the appropriations process. These agencies do not have to present a budget, request the Congress, and they receive their funding without annual congressional action. Do you believe, sir, that putting CFPB and other financial regulators in the appropriations process would improve their accountability to Congress and the taxpayer? And also, with deficits approaching $1 trillion a year, would you support reducing the number of agencies whose operations are considered mandatory and not reviewed each year?
Thank you for that question, and it is something that we think should go through the appropriations process. To the extent that there are agencies like CFPB, like the Office of Financial Research, it's important that we move in a direction, and we do it in two-year steps by 2020, to be able to ensure that this committee and other subcommittees across the appropriations process get an opportunity to bring those requests before and have Congress actually pass on it. The appropriations process is something that's very important. It's an important oversight. Congress has the power of the purse. To the extent that Congress has delegated its power of the purse to provide some of these automatic spending situations, we don't think that's a healthy scenario, and it's one of the reasons we've tried to reform it.
What progress have we made towards that?
Well, we've had proposals in our budgets. We certainly need Congress to act on our budgets, and we would love to continue the conversation as to if there's any particular questions that this committee has on on roadblocks that it sees to moving in that direction. We'd be willing to have that conversation, but Congress needs to act.
Once again, we're failing to do our job.
We have many proposals that we believe that are important for this committee and Congress to enact.
That was a softball for you. So. I know the United States faces many threats: terrorist organizations, international criminal drug cartels, regimes in China, Russia, Iran, Venezuela. How does the current administration's request for defense spending rebuild our nation's security responsibilities?
Well, we think it's one of the promises that this president is keeping with this budget. We think it's absolutely vital that in a situation of $22 trillion in debt, $1 trillion deficits as far as the eye can see, that we don't take a backseat to anyone in being able to defend the country. This president came to office promising to rebuild the military. We think a 5% increase for defense is something that is justified. And we believe that we've put forward a strategy to be able to continue the defense rebuild within the current caps.
And what, if any, steps, just because I don't work in your office and I don't know what you're doing, but I'm sure some is going on, what, if any, steps are being taken to use the electronic age to reduce and secure and speed up the way we do transitions? Let me give you an example. I go to the VA. The VA tells me that the biggest problem they have in the intake process is they have to refer the member back to their discipline, whether it's Army, Navy, get their records, come back to the VA, where they're then scanned in. That seems sort of stupid in this day and age, don't you think?
It does sound that way. It's also one of the reasons we've invested in making sure that health records are electronic and portable between DOD and VA. One of the things that United States Digital Service does is they spend a lot of time at agencies such as VA to be able to streamline these kinds of processes to make them as smooth for the consumer as possible. So that is something that we do get involved with and working with agencies across the government to do.
All due respect, sir, these aren't consumers. I mean, these are our veterans, and they deserve better treatment. Obviously, we know who they are when they're in the service, and they should be transitioned properly, and that's something I think we all owe more attention and duty to. And I don't mean to be rude to get up and leave, but I have a 10:30 hearing downstairs in Interior, and I appreciate the chair's indulgence. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Welcome to you, Mr. Vaught. As you may or may not know, I come from a rural district in Georgia, and I'm an avid supporter of USDA's rural development programs. I also happen to serve as the chair of the Agriculture, Rural Development, and FDA and related agencies subcommittee of the Appropriations Committee. It was disheartening, very disheartening, to see for the third consecutive year a budget that drastically cuts or eliminates several of the rural development programs. The budget cut rural development by almost 20%, and 29 programs are eliminated. These programs are vital to communities like mine and are often the only means to access credit or grant funding. They help underserved and underserved markets that are often forgotten or left behind by larger financial institutions. They are not duplicative of other federal government programs because they're the only ones available. They create private sector jobs and they grow economies. I just believe very strongly that rural America needs to be protected. There's no reason why a child or a family in rural America should not have the resources and access to all of the necessary resources to realize their full potential. And of course, this budget would undermine that possibility. So can you tell me why the budget continues to drastically reduce or eliminate USDA rural development programs? And please don't say it's a question of priorities, because serving rural America should be a priority for all of us. And I just am very, very, very upset. Unfortunately, the will of Congress has not been such as to go along with those drastic cuts. And I just want to know what's going through the head of the people over in your agency that would propose such a drastic cut.
Well, we would certainly agree with you on the importance of rural America. It is something that we have designed the last 3 budgets with an eye towards. If you look at our infrastructure proposal, one of the things that it speaks to, one of the reasons we want it to not just be surface transportation is because we think that there's important rural needs that can be addressed through infrastructure. If you look at the broadband funding that we provide within USDA, that is another attempt to make sure that rural America has the needs that rural America has are being addressed. To the extent that we reform or eliminate programs, it's always done with the vantage point that we think that the programs don't work. Understand there would be a disagreement with you on that, but it's also something where we're willing to engage in conversation about.
Look at the USDA Reconnect program. It was initially funded in the 2018 omnibus at $600 million, and the 2019 omnibus provided an additional $550 million. It was intended by Congress to expand broadband access and facilitate deployment to unserved and underserved populations, which are predominantly in rural areas. And one of the features that makes this an important improvement over the current USDA broadband loan program would be to enable the entity to pair loans with grants and to make projects financially viable. Funding projects with both loans and grants would significantly limit the risk to the federal government. But OMB recently calculated subsidy rates for Reconnect loan grant program that will make it even more expensive than the current loan program. This means less money would be available to connect communities to the world that we all take for granted. Tell me, why would you do something like that? It just doesn't make any sense.
Well, we're never trying to take away. When we calculate loan rates and subsidy rates, what we're trying to do is get the best estimate that we have at the time. We believe that we put forward a very healthy request regarding rural broadband, that there's money in the system and that needs to be spent wisely over time, and it is a priority for the administration, and we look forward to working with you on it.
Well, there are just too many rural communities that don't have access, and the programs that are designed to give access are being cut, or at least you're attempting to cut them from the Office of Management and Budget, and it just makes no sense. You're speaking out of both sides of your mouth, and I find that very unacceptable. I yield back.
Mr. Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And, you know, I think it's important for all of us on different subcommittees to understand that what's being presented to us is our budget request based on a current cap environment that might not lead to where the administration's priorities are. It just leads to the administration having to make tough decisions. And so what Mr. Vaught has presented to us is a budget recommendation that abides by current law. I imagine if the cap were in a different position, then the priorities may be differently funded as well. So they're having to make difficult choices. Just revisiting real quick for the chairman here, my understanding is that it's not prohibited nor illegal for a White House official to use a personal device for official business. It's not recommended, obviously, but it's not illegal. But it is required that any kind of communication be documented and relayed to archives and such within 20 days or so. So just as long as the information is. So there's no prohibition against using any app or no app, on a personal device that I'm aware of.
Can I ask a question in response? If it has to be documented, how could WhatsApp comply with that?
My understanding is screenshots, forwarding emails, forwarding text messages, things like that. Yeah.
The time is yours.
That's
sir.
it. Mr. Vaught, I want to give you an opportunity. I think, as I talked about earlier, that you've put a lot of work into this. Your team has as well. The administration has a vision for our country. You've recognized the difficulty of the inherited debt that you've had to embrace. But you've put together a vision for our country through this budget recommendation. And that really is a vision, right? So I want to give you the opportunity to at least share with us your vision, the administration's vision for where you see where the country can be and go in our economy, where the American people, investments and such like that, based on what's been presented to us. Because you had presented a really good op-ed that I recommend to all the members to read, and in which, I'll quote, you said, annual deficits are on the verge of exceeding $1 trillion each year for the foreseeable future, and interest payments, and this is what should be shocking to everybody, that our interest payments on the national debt are projected to exceed military spending by 2025, and that's an amazing, that's an astonishing quote from your op-ed. And but we should recognize that the national debt did double, nearly double, under the previous administration. So please take an opportunity to share with us your vision, the administration's vision, before we get back into, I know, some more detailed questions.
Sure, thank you, Congressman. Our vision is to ensure that we can pay off our debt and deal with our trillion-dollar deficits in the years ahead, that this is not a way that an ordinary family across the country does their fiscal business. We want to get back in the business of balancing our budget. It's one of the reasons why we do it. We say we're going to do it within 15 years. It would have been easy to say that we can never balance. We don't actually agree with that. We want to be able to engage in the conversation about balance and try to lower our spending. We also want to be able to continue to ensure that the American people have a amount of revenue, keep the revenue that's their own, and that revenues coming into the federal government stay at their historical level of GDP. We don't want the American people to have to pay more of their hard-earned money to be able to support the government that we have. And that has been something that is part of the promises kept. We also think it's important that Congress needs to get after its spending problem. We have put forward more spending reductions than any administration in history. We have put forward them from the beginning of the administration. This is now the third budget in which we have put forward more spending reductions than any president's budget in history. People talk about mandatory spending. We have put forward more mandatory spending reforms and savings proposals than any administration in history. And so we do believe that this is an important conversation to have about how we're spending the hard-working people's tax dollars, and it's something that, Congress has the power of the purse, and we need Congress to act on these proposals.
No, that's a great point. It reminds me back, I guess, in the first couple of months of the administration, you presented through, at the time, I guess, Director Mulvaney was over OMB, a rescissions package of here's a lot of money, I guess billions of dollars, was it 5, 6, 7 billions of dollars that is not going to be spent, has not been spent. The programs have been fully exhausted, and there's money sitting here. And my recollection is that Congress's action was nothing.
That's exactly right.
Rejected cutting spending of funds that are just dollars are sitting there that will not be spent and cannot be spent. So I would, I appreciate your boldness with this proposal, and I think it's important for us as Congress to understand this is an administration making a recommendation to Congress on a way to save money in the future and to assist the taxpayers, and it's really up to us to embrace it or not embrace it. And as history has shown, we typically do not embrace reductions in spending. Mr. Chairman, I'll go back.
Thank you. Ms. Torres.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Vaught, for being here. In your statement, you state that OMB is reducing its budget by 11% below its fiscal year 2019 enacted level, and that this demonstrates its commitment to fiscal discipline and efficiency as it asks other agencies to make severe cuts. Is that correct?
That is correct.
A closer look at the actual budget request reveals that your statement is misleading at best. In fact, when comparing apples to apples, the OMB budget request reflects a cut of just 0.4%, below the current level, nowhere near the 11% as you suggest in your testimony. It seems to me that you are inflating the extent to which OMB is trimming its own bottom line by including the proposed reduction for the U.S. Digital Service, which is not a core part of OMB's statutory responsibilities. And in addition, your calculation counts as a cut, a function that you are simply transferring elsewhere. If you are going to count the $1 million transfer of the Intellectual Property Enforcement Coordinator out of OMB and its own appropriation, you must also subtract that function from the figure you are using for comparison purposes. So, Mr. Vaught, isn't it more accurate to say that OMB's budget is really only decreased by $400,000?
No, and here's why.
Do you think that it is appropriate for OMB to ask agencies to make 9% cuts on average without being willing to do the same?
Congresswoman, we have an 11% cut, and we actually took the challenge from this subcommittee to heart when we put this budget together to be able to put forth reductions that we have asked other agencies to do. OMB has both accounts, OMB's normal main budget request and the ITOR fund. The ITOR fund doesn't just fund USDS, it also funds all of our management responsibilities as it pertains to financial information control. So from a standpoint of OMB, these are both, just think of it as two different accounts, all within the OMB banner. We are moving $1 million out of OMB for IPAC, and we are paying for that within other savings within the larger executive office of the president. So you're right. If we were saying that we weren't going to absorb that cost with savings elsewhere within the EOP, that would be double counted. We're not doing that, but we are saying, from the standpoint of OMB, we can find many millions in savings from areas within the USDS that we think in this environment we need to do less of, and we need to work with agencies to make sure that we're getting reimbursed for the essentially consulting services that we're providing for those agencies.
So OMB received an $8 million more in funding between 2017 and 2019, an 8% increase. Is that correct?
Sounds about right.
So you propose what is essentially flat funding in the budget request. Does that really demonstrate a commitment to fiscal discipline within the agency? Or is that a case of what's mine is mine and what's yours is negotiable when it comes to dealing with fairly with other agencies?
Absolutely not. As I just said, Congressman, we have two accounts. We have an 11% cut for OMB. We reduce one of those accounts greater than the other account, but those are fully part of OMB. They are fully part of our responsibilities. We do think that from the standpoint of within ITOR, where can we find savings? We have prioritized our statutory responsibilities under the eGov Act. But the work of the United States Digital Service is very important. They've found about $8 billion in savings for agencies based on their important work. We want that work to continue, and that's one of the reasons that we've tried to figure out in this environment, how do we structure USDS with reimbursable agreements so that it is a long-term, sustained way to be able to do business?
I'd like an opportunity to dive more into those numbers with you to see exactly where you are coming up with a 9% cut. On another issue, I've introduced the 911 Saves Act, a bipartisan bill that directs OMB to update their classification for public safety telecommunicators as a protective service within the Standard Occupations Classification, SOC, catalog. The current version of the SOC categorizes public safety telecommunicators as office and administrative support occupations, which includes secretaries, office clerks, and taxi cab dispatchers. Someone who negotiates with someone who is trying to kill themselves, someone who negotiates with somebody who is holding someone hostage. I can hardly would describe them as something equal to a secretary or a taxi cab dispatcher. Public safety communicators should be categorized as protective service occupations, which includes a broad range of protective occupations: lifeguards, fish and game wardens, parking enforcement workers, etc. On September 8th, 2016, I sent a letter requesting that this change be reviewed, and OMB has denied this request to change the classification. The rationale on this SOC website stated the work performed is that of a dispatcher is not of a first responder. As I stated to you, most dispatchers are dealing with critical incidents at any given time. Mr. Chairman, I ask for unanimous consent to submit a letter into the record that I wrote. It's dated September 8th, 2016, asking for OMB to review this classification. Thank you. And while you may not have been working for the OMB at the time, can you explain that decision-making process behind this response?
Ms. Torres, I think if we can come back, we
Okay.
go and pass the time.
I'm sorry.
No problem.
I didn't realize I lost track of my time.
It's all right.
Yield
We'll come
back.
back. Thank you. Mr. Amade?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Vaught, I've got an issue that I'd kind of like the opportunity to speak with your staff as a beginning thing at some point in time in the relatively near future, and here it is. My state's a little unique in that the Department of the Interior, primarily through the Bureau of Land Management, but also through the Bureau of Reclamation, and then also through the Forest Service, owns about 85% of the state. Now, I'm not here to lament that fact. I'm just saying that's a fact. Regardless of who you are, what you like, what you don't like, they own most of it. So at a higher percentage than any other state of the nation, the federal government has a federal estate that is supermajority of the land. And as we look at this, and as I go through, for instance, BLM has 6 district offices that cover that. And as I go through, and by the way, this is not new. It goes through, it crosses administrations. But for instance, I was in the district office in a place called Winnemucca, which is not a Yiddish swear word. It's really the name of a town in Nevada. And they have about 120 people on the books for that BLM district office in Winnemucca. About a third of those positions are empty. Not positions that somebody fought to have added or whatever. They're part of their standard, here's what it takes to operate that district office. That fact is not unusual for all of those offices, all those 6 offices. And it's probably a fact district-wide, and as well as the state office. But here's my problem. We sit there and say, we didn't add positions because somebody's trying to build an empire. These are consistently on the books. And then we look at budget and we go, there's consistently a budget that says you don't have money to fill a third of the people that somebody thinks you need to run your district in a state where you own 8+ acres out of every 10. You say, well, okay, so what's the problem? The problem is, and this administration's made no secret of the fact they value the federal estate and they don't want to transfer much in lands bills. Okay? So on the one hand, it's like we value the federal estate and we don't want to get rid of a single acre. And on the other hand, from the historical manpower things that it takes to run, owning, and managing those resources, recreation, energy, you name it, we're a third down the whole time. And then to add the final piece for your consideration, where you just got to chuckle, is you go, oh, and by the way, the money sitting in that account by virtue of the Southern Nevada Public Lands Management Act, which does resource-related federal estate things, which turned 20 last year, we're going to strip that to balance the budget. Now, I'm not going to get into with you whether that's legal or not or whatever, but it's like, so we're taking money from federal lands, using it to balance the budget, but we don't want lands bills, which, by the way, the Southern Nevada Public Lands Management Act over 20 years sold about 35,000 acres out of the 56 million acre federal estate. So you're getting my gist here, where it's like there's some serious mixed messages floating around. So my challenge to you, before I go back to Interior, because we've tried that before, I sit here looking, continually cutting budgets for a federal estate that grows in value and complexity to make all those different land uses work, and at the same time saying, by the way, the money you got from those proceeds, we're going to take into the, not even some resource-related account. It's just going to go to the Treasury of the U.S., and you're sitting there going, so don't sell land, but we want the money from the sales, and oh, by the way, we don't want to man it. Final piece. During the last shutdown, when it was time to say who was key and who wasn't key, that shutdown started out with one person in the Bureau of Land Management who owns 2/3 of the state. That was the only key person. And so as we're sitting here looking at the policy, and we're going, wow, you control that one agency, 2/3 of the land in the state, and yet one person is considered key if you have that person's cell phone. Now, towards the end of the shutdown, that got a little bit better, but quite frankly, I think it's time for people in OMB, when you talk about budget, how do you function as a federal agency? Well, guess what? Budget's a fairly significant part of that. So I want to have that conversation with your folks to say, hey, listen, if it's just all bad news and that's the way it is, then fine. But I think it'd be a good time for a healthy dose of A, reality, and B, if you really need those people to run, owning 85% of that 6th largest state in the nation, we probably ought to fund them. I'll look forward to our meeting.
Would welcome the conversation. I've got some responses to various of the pieces. I don't have much time, but I would just say I welcome that conversation, and I look forward to working with you on those issues.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Acting Director Vaught, your budget would slash non-defense discretionary funds by more than $1 trillion, crippling our economic and our national security by disinvesting in education, public health, energy, healthcare research, infrastructure, veterans healthcare, law enforcement, food safety, disease prevention and control. And the list goes on, but I want to focus today on the massive gargantuan cuts to Medicare, some $500 billion, or as you've referred to those cuts yourself previously as savings. I know you said that spending will increase in Medicare year over year, but it won't increase as much as is scheduled, as if this administration hadn't taken a hatchet to health care. I have seniors in my hospitals in my district, seniors that come to seniors fairs and talk to me about, they're cutting Medicare. How can this be? The president promised he'd never touch it. So I have to ask, in calculating these cuts to Medicare, did you calculate for the fact that healthcare inflation is rising faster than general inflation and the increase need that would create? Did you calculate the increase in the aging population because of the baby boomers and the growth in Medicare enrollment? Did you calculate the effects of these cuts and what those effects would be on access to care, especially in districts like mine in northeastern Pennsylvania, where access to care can often be a life or death issue? Those are 3 questions. If you forget one, let me know.
I'll let you know. We certainly considered all of those factors. We do not cut Medicare in this budget. Medicare grows every year. The president has made no structural changes to Medicare in this budget. We do have savings in Medicare from things like trying to lower drug pricing, which I know this Democrat majority has an interest in trying to work with us on.
We say democratic, actually.
Sure. We also have proposals to take out of Medicare certain things that we don't think should be in Medicare. We don't do away with them. Uncompensated care to non-Medicare beneficiaries, we think is something that should be provided for. We take it out of the Medicare trust fund so that it doesn't impact the solvency of that important trust fund, and we allow it to grow. Similarly, bad debt is something that in the private marketplace, insurance companies go and make sure that they are getting the cost sharing of their beneficiaries. We pay for that at the federal government level, and we say instead of paying 65% of those bad debts, we're only going to pay 25% of it. So these are waste, fraud, and abuse. Everyone wants to kind of malign the notion of waste, fraud, and abuse. We've identified specific proposals that allow us to save money in Medicare, push the solvency of the trust fund out 8 years, and keep the president's commitments.
Did you calculate the increase in the aging population? Did you include that in your calculations?
We assumed all of the baseline drivers of our mandatory spending in assessing these proposals. That doesn't mean that we didn't attempt, particularly Medicaid, and I couldn't tell from your proposal whether you were talking about Medicare or Medicaid.
Medicare.
On Medicaid, we're growing as well each and every year.
Did you calculate for the fact that healthcare inflation is rising faster than general inflation?
We are aware of that, but we are also saying that the federal government's...
That's a yes or no kind of question.
Well, it actually isn't, Congressman, because the federal government's policies have an impact on how fast healthcare expenditures grow. So to the extent that we don't have policies that allow for states at the Medicaid level to slow the growth of these important programs, we are also increasing the rate at which healthcare spending grows. So we think that the two are completely in line.
And did you calculate the effects that these cuts would have in access to care, especially in districts like mine, where access to care can be a life or death issue?
We considered all of these factors in putting together our proposals. We don't think that it will have adverse impacts on the populations that depend on these proposals.
And in your world, just so I'm clear on it, taking $500 billion out of the planned expenditures is not a cut. I still have to work on that, grasping that whole concept, Acting Director Vaught. I yield back.
We're going to go to a second round, but since Mr. Christ has walked in, I want to finish the first round where everyone gets one shot, if that's okay. Mr. Christ, do you have questions at this point?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, and thank you, sir, for being here today. Appreciate that. Do you know who in America depends on Medicare and Social Security?
Seniors?
Yes, mostly seniors and disabled individuals. Millions of seniors, the seniors that built this country and got us to this point. And let's try, if you know who depends upon Medicaid.
The elderly, the disabled, pregnant, are in a situation now where the populations that Medicaid was designed for get a lower match than populations it was not designed for. One of the proposals that we have in this budget is to go back to go towards a block grant so that states would have more of an opportunity to design their programs to ensure that the populations that Medicaid was established for get the care that they need.
Thank you. I understand that you're here to talk about and defend the budget request, and I appreciate that you're doing that. But it's hard for me to understand the administration breaking a campaign promise to not cut Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security and programs that are so important to certainly my constituents, and I would imagine the constituents of all of us on this committee. The proposal is over $1 trillion cut in Medicare and Medicaid. Can you explain that to me?
Yeah, I would just unpack the numbers in a different way. We don't cut Medicare or Medicaid. Medicare, we have $516 billion in savings. Medicare will keep going up. There's no structural changes to Medicare. If we make a change to lower drug pricing, that causes a savings for Medicare because of the fact that the government pays for the drug bills of seniors. In Medicaid, one of the things that is important to understand in the numbers is that we are shifting a lot of the spending that's currently going into Medicaid into the state healthcare block grants. And so the Medicaid number doesn't tell the story as much as the combined picture of both Medicaid and the state healthcare block grants, at which point we do have a $217 billion saver, but Medicaid and the state healthcare block grants are all going to go up every year if you compare it to 18.
So reported reductions in Medicare of over $800 billion are not accurate?
Those are false because they don't characterize the reforms that we are doing to take things that are not rightfully part of the Medicare program, take them out of Medicare trust fund and ensure that they grow separately. So for instance, uncompensated care to non-Medicare beneficiaries. We still fund it. We don't fund it in Medicare. And so it shows it's now not in Medicare, and so that the higher number that you referenced doesn't take into account some of those reforms where we're doing it elsewhere in the federal budget.
If it's not in Medicare, where does it go?
Still goes to hospitals. It's still uncompensated care. It grows at a different rate, and it's part of the other aspects of the federal government's spending.
So you're representing today that there are no reductions in Medicare, no reductions in Medicaid. The reports that we have been provided are inaccurate, and that the administration is going to increase Medicare and Medicaid this year?
Yes.
To what extent? How much?
I don't have the Medicare figures in front of me or the Medicaid figures, but they're going to be going up each and every year.
You are the head of OMB, and you don't have the numbers?
I have a lot of numbers at my disposal. I can get you the numbers on a year-by-year basis as it pertains to those specific line items.
Yeah, I'd appreciate it if you would prioritize Medicare and Medicaid. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We'll start another second round. Mr. Graves, will let you start.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Vaught, one of my, you're probably aware, one of my emphasis or priorities has been cybersecurity and what are we going to do as to enable and particularly the private sector to actively defend themselves. I feel like, and individuals, I feel like that as a country we really don't have good policy when it comes to this new theater that's out there, cyber warfare. In fact, the Cyber Fraud and Abuse Act really has not been updated in decades. And so I've been putting forward some bold proposals on how we might address that to allow others to actively engage outside of a network, to help with attribution, to defend their own network outside of their network, to use beaconing technology, some other things such as that. That is one silo of cybersecurity that is something that I'm very focused on. But then there's the other silo that we hear about here, and that is the public sector. And each agency comes before us, and they'll say that cyber is a major concern, and we all know it is. And they're all asking for unique proposals on funding requests as it relates to cyber security. Can you just share with us the overall plan, as you know it, or how we could best help and assist in not putting together a patchwork kind of cyber defense system for the federal government, but what might we do and how can we best help moving forward as you see it from your perch?
Thanks for the question. It is a priority for this administration in terms of cybersecurity spending. We spend about $15 billion on it. That's a 5% increase. One of the things our management colleagues have been very interested in prioritizing is making sure that we have enough cybersecurity workers. We have shortages as it pertains to the number of people that we need in the federal government to fulfill these roles. So we have been working to come up with different training programs to make sure that we take people that might have different skills and then can be reskilled into cybersecurity. That has been a priority of the president's management agenda. So I think engaging where the problem is something that we would love to continue to work with this committee and you on, and trying to make sure we're doing it from a comprehensive way as best we possibly can.
Sure. And I think there's a lot of overlap, too, in what I've proposed, and I encourage you and your team to look at it, the Active Cyber Defense and Certainty Act, and just trying to give some certainty as to what can be done to actively defend networks. And that overlap, I feel like the private sector can join with the public sector, and rather than be dependent on hoping somebody else is doing this or somebody else is assisting somewhere else. The passive nature in which we sit as a country should be alarming to everyone, that we're basically in a passive posture when it comes to cybersecurity and the threats that exist out there. So look forward to working with you and the team on that, because I think that should be a priority that is bipartisan all the way around. And then with just a few seconds left here, I want to talk about the border security plan as proposed in this budget. I think it's right to come back at this and address this as a crisis. And I was a part of the conference committee that worked on this. We heard the facts. We heard the information in classified settings. And it was extremely alarming and disturbing. And had every member had access to that information, I have a feeling that the tone might be different, because when you hear from the experts and you hear the true facts and you see the data, it should be something that we want to address. And so maybe just take the last 60 seconds here to tell us about what the upcoming plan is there.
Sure. We have put forward what we think is resources necessary to secure the border, to keep the President's commitment to build the full wall. The situation's gotten worse on the border. I remember those very meetings that we would have in December where the Secretary of Homeland Security was attempting to get Speaker Pelosi's attention. She was trying to put forward the facts as we knew them now about the situation on the border. They've gotten worse. In the first 6 months, in terms of apprehensions, we are going to exceed what we did last year. We are approaching the same levels that we saw 10 years or so when apprehensions at their were all-time historical high. Here's the difference. 10, 15 years ago, those were apprehensions of single adults that would come across the border, and then we would typically return them within 48 hours. The difference now is that these migrants are coming across as families from regions in the world that we don't have the ability, because of our laws, to just send them back. And so they end up staying here even when 9 times out of 10 they don't have a legal right to stay here because of the asylum laws that are in place. And as a result, we are saddling ICE and CBP with their responsibilities, but they don't have the resources and the facilities to be able to house all of these individuals. So it's a crisis. This is an area where we're tired of being right. And we put forward a resources request that we believe is necessary to secure the border. And our hope is that Congress engages with us on the facts going forward.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Continue the second round, sir. In September of 2017, OMB issued a memorandum reminding agency heads of existing travel policies for government officials and requiring the White House Chief of Staff to approve travel on government-owned, rented, leased, or chartered aircraft. The memo also said that OMB is reviewing the existing guidance on the use of such aircraft. Is the guidance requiring the White House Chief of Staff to approve travel on government aircraft still in place?
The guidance that we put in place is still in effect, and we're in the midst of updating that guidance as well right now.
Well, and I want to get to the update in just a second, sir. What does the guidance say when there's a vacancy in the Chief of Staff at the White House?
The Chief of Staff has assumed all the acting Chief of Staff has assumed all of the responsibilities of the Chief of Staff in the same way that as acting OMB Director, I've assumed all the responsibilities of the OMB Director. So from the standpoint of the acting Chief of Staff, he's a detailee from OMB to the Chief of Staff, but he is reviewing all of, he makes all of those types of decisions.
Now, has the OMB collected information about the overall use of such aircraft since the issuance of that memorandum?
I don't believe we have.
Is it possible for you to do so?
I'm happy to work with the committee and look into that.
Okay. And you talked about reviewing this guidance. Where are you on this, and do you have proposed changes at this time?
It's too soon to be able to reveal where we're headed on that, but we are in the midst of updating those guidance, and it's part of the deliberative process to work through that.
This process that you're talking about began in September of 2017?
Yes, I'm not sure when we officially began the update process.
That's sort of the ballpark, though, right?
It's about the ballpark, yeah.
So that's over a year and a half ago, roughly? Any guess on when you might be completed with that review and issuance of new guidance?
I don't have a date to give the subcommittee at this point, but we are working on it.
Okay. I'm going to ask you to hazard a guess, just because it's been a year and a half. Administration has, under this term, about that much time left. Is it going to be done before the administration is through with this term?
We're working as quickly as we possibly can on it, sir.
All right. Mr. Amade?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Vaught, the chairman commented after my last question that was quite a speech, leaving you 8 seconds to respond. Therefore, I will, if you have any thoughts that come to mind based on that, to turn it into an actual potential question.
Sure.
Please feel free to respond regarding the staffing at those federal land management agencies, as well as the SNPLMA raid thing. And raid's about a nice word, and I've had the South Carolina explanation, so anything new to that would be much appreciated.
And you've got an 8-second bubble as well.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. With the account that you referenced, we look at, there's $600 million in the fund. We have proposed to rescind $200 million of it. None of the rescissions that we have identified are geared towards anything that is specifically allotted for a particular project right now. Now, I think your point might be, well, you haven't accounted for the fact that new projects may arise, and that's fair, but we've also had a hard time, at least from our analysis, of seeing additional new projects that are arising. So from our standpoint, $200 million is something that we could return to taxpayers and not hurt the intent of the program.
Well, and I appreciate that, except if you look at the base legislation, it doesn't allow that.
And that's why it's a proposal. Yeah. It's a proposal for Congress.
I got it.
As it pertains to the shutdown, the length of the shutdown obviously caused us to update our lapse plans in real time to account for the factual situation on the ground. So I wasn't aware of the situation with only one BLM employee working under a lapse. But I know that we were working with all of the agencies as they were seeing real needs, and then abiding by the law to make it as painless as possible, consistent with the law, and engaging in that conversation. And then as it pertains to the BLM staffing issues, I know that's been an interest of yours for a long time. We welcome that conversation. Our reforms to Interior are not designed to not have BLM fully staffed up. They're attempting to get at things like the fact that we want to put a halt on land acquisition, and to ensure that the federal government doesn't own more than 25% of the land in this country. So that's the intent behind of our budget proposal, and we're certainly willing to work with you.
Well, and I appreciate that, but as you can appreciate, and they're kind of connected, is when you bring an agency to full stop that's doing land management in a state that in the Southwest basically competes for fastest growing state in the nation for probably a decade or two. They compete with the Valley of Sun. And you say, no, we're not processing any right-of-way applications, even though they're an existing right-of-way. No, we're not doing any of the ESA stuff. We're not updating any of our resource management plans, our travel management plans. We're not doing anything for that period of time. Then you go back and say, okay, we're back. Well, wait a minute, because we got to catch up from the shutdown. And so all I'm saying is, if it's going to end up being the equivalent of a double or triple shutdown by the time they catch back up, we probably ought to think about that before we say you're not key. Because quite frankly, the shadow that 1 month or whatever it was casts is much longer than a month in an operations sense, and is exacerbated by the fact that you're staffed at 67% of what's on the books. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Vaught, the President's FY 2020 budget request once again proposes a pay freeze for federal employees despite low unemployment and federal law suggesting that employees receive 2.6% raise before locality pay is factored in. Furthermore, the budget request calls for cuts to employee pay through increased retirement contributions and reduced government contributions to employee health care. As the 35-day government shutdown demonstrated, federal employees provide critical services that the American people rely on every single day. If we want to recruit and retain top talent, we have to provide employees at the minimum with a pay increase to keep up with the cost of living. Can you explain why the administration is working so hard to harm federal employee paychecks?
We're not, Congressman. We think it's important to ensure that we have a healthy federal workforce. It's one of the priorities of the President's management agenda. The type of data that we look at is the fact that if you look at the Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey, which is basically a survey of all federal workers, only 25% of the current federal workforce thinks that pay has any connection with performance. We think that that is the wrong way to be able to align incentives. And so what we have said is that putting forward a proposal in this budget to give agencies more discretion to be able to have bonus payments, increase salaries for recruitment and retention. What we have rejected is just to do an across-the-board cut because we think that that is the wrong way to align incentives.
Well, your budget proposes that agencies use their performance awards accounts to finance more strategic workforce award spending and innovative approaches to meeting critical recruitment, retention, and reskilling needs across government by using their awards funding to reward their most critical employees with the best performance. Can you provide some additional details as to what you mean by this? Does it mean that only certain occupations will receive pay increases? And outstanding performance by attorneys, law enforcement officers, customer service representatives, and administrative staff, among others, would not be recognized?
Not necessarily. We'd be working with the agency heads to be able to design plans that be able to fill high priority areas are addressed, but also high performance across the agency are also receiving the kinds of incentive payments that their merit, their performance had justified. And then I would also note that we didn't have it in our 19 budget, but Congress gave these workers across the board cut or across the board increase in their pay. And so that is something that is also going to be there for them to benefit from as well.
Yeah, but that certainly was not at the instance of the administration.
I agree with that.
That was in the wisdom of Congress. And isn't it, well, it appears to me from where I sit and from talking with federal employees that the Office of Management and Budget is doing everything that it can to cleverly conceal an effort to reduce the federal workforce, therefore having fewer people to provide the services that the public requires, particularly those involving the health, safety, and welfare of our people, particularly in commercial regulations. It seems to me that all of this is a sleight of hand, if you will, with mumbo-jumbo justifications for actually cutting the size of the federal workforce at the expense of the benefits of our federal government from the benefits that really should be inuring to the people. I mean, that's just the way that it appears to me, and it seems to be very disingenuous. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Vogt, on the non-defense side, you've asked agencies to make a 9% cut, plus additional 2% cuts year over year under your two-penny plan. Much of this is based on the assumption that agencies will grow more efficient over time. Does your budget treat the Defense Department similarly?
We don't, and I think this would get to a fundamental difference of visions that this administration believes it is the most critical of priorities of the executive branch and the commander-in-chief to continue to provide the resources that the commander-in-chief needs to rebuild the military. In addition, from the standpoint of securing the border. So from the standpoint of a different path in the out years, we do have different paths. We are trying to be able to pay for that rebuilding of the military and the securing our border by looking for where we can do less things at the federal government level in the out years on the non-defense side.
The Defense Department recently underwent its first ever auditing process, and only 5 of the 21 individual audits checked received a fully passing grade. Do your estimates account for the potential savings as the department comes into full audit compliance?
We do, within the amounts that we've provided, we do ask Department of Defense to identify savings that can be transferred to other defense needs. They've already been doing that to the tune of a couple $2 billion with being able to change the way they buy things to make other efficiencies. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. We'll be the first to tell you that. But from the standpoint of the proposal that we put forward, we think it's defensible.
So even though they're not compliant, you think it's defensible to just continue?
Congressman, I think it's important to judge the administration based on what we found.
I'm not talking about the administration. I'm talking about these agencies, the Defense Department, undergoing its first ever auditing process.
Right,
and they were non-compliant.
But from our standpoint, that was a huge success. It was something that Congress had asked us to do.
5 out of 21 individual audits checked received a full passing grade. That's a complete success?
The complete success was doing the audit and beginning the work so that we can make improvements each and every year to be fully compliant in the years ahead.
How are you going to do that? How are you going to ensure that the bulk of these individual audits, the next time you audit, when will you audit them again?
We'll be doing this on a regular basis.
What does that mean?
All I can tell you, Congresswoman, is that the Department of Defense is very committed to the audit. It has the support of its top leaders in making sure that this is a ongoing process to make sure that they have improvements in all the key areas.
So since you continue to bring up the border, I wasn't going to talk about that, but I want to just reassure you that some of us have been very focused on working on the root causes of migration, specifically from the Northern Triangle. Unfortunately, we have received very little support from this administration at ensuring that we support CSIG, for example, in Guatemala, MOXIE in Honduras, and because of that, the rule of law continues to be ignored. Democracies should be moving in the right direction, but they have not. We've chosen to allow them and the presidents there to continue business as usual in a very corrupt way. So the current policies that we have in place to deal with the migrants in our southern border, it's not shocking to me that people are coming north. Current policies have put us in a position that we are liable for the deaths of children, several children, a transgender individual, people who have been blatantly denied health care. So where are you looking at fulfilling the payouts that we may have to be responsible for?
Payouts in terms of
in
what?
lawsuits?
I haven't. That's something that is in the purview of Department of Homeland Security and Department of HHS, but I would just say that anytime we lose a life is tragic. It is something that is.
Anytime we lose a life because we deny them medical health care.
I don't think we've denied
criminal.
anyone health care.
My time has expired, so I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. All right, Mr. Vaught, you and I were talking before about cuts to Medicare, and one of the things that you said was it's not really a cut because we're cutting back on the unholy trinity of waste, fraud, and abuse. I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think you said 15% was a figure you attributed to waste, fraud, and abuse?
No, I was describing our proposal on bad debt.
What was the, let's stick with waste, fraud, and abuse. What would you assign to that?
I didn't do it as a percentage for waste, fraud, and abuse. I was describing one of the proposals that we have in the budget, but we haven't done a kind of percentage allocation that is waste, fraud, and abuse.
Well, you mentioned waste, fraud, and abuse.
I did, as it pertains to the specific proposal on bad debt.
And so the question is, how long have you known about the waste, fraud, and abuse as pertains to bad debt?
I believe it's been in previous budgets. I'd have to check to see whether it was in our first two budgets, but it is something that it was not in our first budget. It may have been in our second. It's something that we made an assessment throughout the year that this is something we wanted to tackle. We don't always have each and every proposal as they change each and every year.
Well, let's talk about that. An assessment is really an assumption, isn't it? You're taking a certain amount of money that you're assuming is wasted or the subject of fraud and abuse, and you figure you can cut it out. And my question is, do you have specific instances of waste, fraud, and abuse that you can put your finger on? And if so, why haven't you raised the call before this year about rooting out those wastes of money?
Well, we have put forward many different proposals about waste, fraud, and abuse when we have proposed historic spending reductions in each and every budget that we've put forward. As it pertains to the Medicare proposals, we had Medicare proposals last year. We have them again this year. This specific proposal that I was referring to gets at trying to ensure that there's an incentive structure for hospitals to recoup the cost sharing that beneficiaries are supposed to pay, as opposed to just saying, we're going to write it off because we know that 65% of it is going to be paid for the federal government. We don't actually say that it should go down to zero. We think it should go to about 25%. And we think that's that allows for the fact that, that hospitals aren't going to be able to recoup all of it, but it does change the incentives so they at least try.
Well, here's why I'm asking these questions, Acting Director Vaught. I'm very concerned when I hear this kind of number being attributed to waste, fraud, and abuse, and I want you to undertake to contact my office when you can drill down and tell me where you think money is being wasted, where you think abuse is occurring, and where you think fraud is occurring. Will you do that?
I'm happy to, Congressman. Just this one proposal would save $38 billion. So that's real money that we think could actually go to extending the life of the Medicare Trust Fund.
Well, in 5 minutes of questioning, I don't think I can get out of you exactly where you think we can save that, so we need to talk offline about this. Now, I also wanted to talk about your budget slashes student loans by more than $200 billion, nutrition assistance by more than $220 billion, and completely crushes the EPA with a cut of more than 30%. And I'm wondering, did you have a specific calculation model that you used to come up with those numbers?
You asked about three different programs. I'm going to go one by one.
Exactly three.
With student loans, we feel like we have a reform proposal that will benefit any student in the country in terms of being able to have a single income driven repayment plan.
Is this a new proposal?
It is not a new proposal. It's been in previous budgets.
What is it called?
Single income driven repayment plan. Okay. It allows you to have certainty. There's all sorts of different programs out there. We're saying that you pay about 12.5% of your discretionary income to be able to then have, after 15 years, get rid of all your student loan debts. For graduate students, that would be 30 years.
I want to follow up with you about that, too. How about your 1/3 cut to EPA? How'd you come up with that?
In an era of trillion-dollar deficits where we have $22 trillion national debt, we think that we should be looking make tough choices at agencies, and to the extent that EPA
Well,
can
is it an
conduct.
indiscriminate cut, or is it a targeted cut?
To the extent that at EPA, we found that they could do their statutory responsibilities to make sure we have clean air, clean water, and at the same time ensure that other discretionary activities are not done or either done at the states. We thought that was something that was defensible.
Subject of robust disagreement, Mr. Acting Director. My time is up, and I yield back.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Acting Director, I wanted to talk to you about FEMA for a moment. FEMA had recently announced proposed changes to the way that they calculate flood risk under the National Flood Insurance Program. I think they call it Risk Rating 2.0. Rather than using just a broad 100-year floodplain, FEMA will instead rely on more granular data to calculate the threat of flooding for each individual home. I have concerns about the impacts that this could have on vulnerable communities, including the likelihood that this could sharply raise rates and send home values plummeting, exacerbating the existing affordability challenges that many constituents and millions of other policyholders already face. However, I can also appreciate FEMA's desire to obtain more accurate data and share that data with consumers. And while I take issue with the administration's method, I think that we can both probably agree that accurate flood risk data is a good thing, right?
Yes.
And I think we can also further agree that floodplain mapping is a huge part of providing better data.
Yes.
Yes. So here's the question. I find it interesting then that the budget request for flood hazard mapping and risk analysis program cuts the program by 60%. How can you reconcile these cuts with what we just discussed of trying to improve upon it?
I believe that gets to the fact that we think that it was one-time spending that had already largely been committed and that we wouldn't need that on a year-to-year basis.
So you're confident that we can go forward, have better mapping,
Yes.
and cut 60% from it?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks to all who participated. Thank you, Acting Director, for being here today. We look forward to working with you in the future. Take care.
Thank you.